Folks, attorneys for the family of Nolan Wells, the 18-year-old black teen who died after the July 4th boating trip in Mississippi, as well as their legal team, met with Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath. After the meeting, Civil Rights Attorney Ben Crump was joined by attorneys Eric Hurt and Nolan's parents for a news conference. Here's some of what was said.
We've just had an opportunity to meet with District Attorney Angel McElrath and some members of her team. We had a very respectful meeting. The thing I assume some of you may know, the thing to announce, she shared with the family that there will be a grand jury that she will turn this case over to once they have collected all the information and finished their investigation. We also agreed that we will have a mutual inspection of the cell phone with our experts and their experts. Attorney Eric Hertz is helping lead the investigation team with former law enforcement experts who are going to help us with the cell phone download. So everybody will be able to see at the same time what the cell phone has. We also talked about trying to make sure we dot every I and cross every T. I know that we're getting about 50 calls a day to 100 calls a day from people who were there on Horn Island, people who are familiar with individuals that were there on Horn Island. And so we continue to be steadfast in trying to get to the truth of why Nolan Wells is dead.
Right now, there's a lot of unanswered questions. We appreciate the district attorney meeting with us, but because of certain types of confidentiality that even the victims are not allowed to know, we did not get all the answers we want. We have an independent investigation going on that involves former law enforcement, federal agents that are going to be looking into all the different information we got. The calls are coming in and we're getting a lot of information. Some of the people that I spoke to are not talking with the law enforcement here. We're going to be trying to get them to cooperate with each other because we want to make sure the narrative, which has been put out that is false, is going to be corrected. So at this point, we just ask everybody to keep calling in if you have any information and let us know. And I personally, if we validate you're a legitimate call, we'll call you and talk to you.
We want to celebrate Nolan, and he would not want us to be sitting around crying and eating. And so what we're going to do is kind of have a party to celebrate him, and that'll be held at the Jackson County Fairgrounds. So we really do want to keep it for family and friends. We are going to allow media to come in as well. And lastly,
His teammates.
Oh, absolutely, teammates. We've already contacted Coach Les George because we want to make sure that those guys are there. Former teammates from high school, middle school, teams that he played against. You guys are all welcome. But of course, we want to make sure that our families for sure and close friends get there. So I do want to just say for those of you, again, if you are having protests, even the day of his service, I am asking you guys to just keep it peaceful. Nolan would never want any type of violence or anything like that. He was not that kind of person. So if you guys would, again, just be peaceful. And to the community, thank you so much. Just the outpouring of love, support. We've had some local officials. Mayor Casey Vaughn from Gaucher has reached out to us. Oh my gosh, I can't even tell you. He has, it's almost been every day. He's been texting to check on us. Also, Jeffrey Hullum, thank you so much. He's been texting pretty much every day. Receiving a lot of stories from Nolan's teachers, which just warms my heart, his classmates, teammates. So again, for those of you who have donated to the GoFundMe, once again, I stress, if you are not financially able to, we're not begging for that money, okay? If you're not financially able to, we understand. We thank you for whatever you can give, but if you cannot, if you would, just keep us in your prayers. And to his friends, stay strong, and please just take care of your mental health, because I know this is a lot. It's a lot for us, and I know you guys are feeling some of that too. So thank you all.
Folks, the funeral for Nolan Wells would take place at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, on Monday, July 20th. Visitation will be 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. The funeral will be 11 a.m., and we'll be carrying that live right here on the Black Star Network. Bringing my panel right now. Joining us today is Dr. Derek Jackson, State Representative out of the Georgia District, out of Atlanta. Also, Reverend Shonda Nicole Gladden, CEO of Good to the Soul, also a pastor at La Plata AME Church in Charles County, Maryland. Also on the show, Ryan Basham, political analyst, LGBTQ, and activist and content creator out of Los Angeles. Glad to have all three of you here. You heard the attorneys there, Derek, and they're absolutely right. Listen, it's a lot that we don't know. The investigation is ongoing, and the worst thing in the world are to see these people on social media just throwing up all sorts of nonsense that that can't be corroborated. That just simply makes this worse.
Yes, it does. First off, my condolences to Nolan's parents and their family and friends. But there's a lot of unknown. And why is that, Roland? When you think about all the unknowns, and then you have local police officers on social media, they're adding fuel to this fire too. And so from time and time again, this is another example, unfortunately, when it comes to Black and brown communities, that we can't get access to the information. You've already heard Attorney Crump said they're still waiting on an independent autopsy. They want the facts, they want the figures, so that way they can get justice for Nolan and his family. They can make sure that they can inform the media and platforms such as yourself to get the truth out. And so that's the reason why we're still dealing with all these unknowns. And for this length of time, we're talking about July 4th, Roland. Think about this for a second. Over 11 days, the story has continued to drag on and on and on. So the social media would do one thing, but we as elected officials, as law enforcement, we have a responsibility, and that's to provide justice to Nolan and his family, to make sure we get the facts out and not drag our feet on these kind of issues, such as the autopsy, such as getting the facts and the data. The FBI is just finally looking at the data, FBI. And so that's the reason why, unfortunately, Roland, that you see in all these stories taking on itself organically. And that's so unfortunate.
Listen, the thing that I got to remind people, Shonda, is that when people are spouting off on social media, this is a family. This is a family that is grieving. They lost their son. To listen to these idiots on social media blaming the parents for what took place. Oh, you should let your kid hang out with some white folks. It's just nonsensical, and it's just pathetic, because again, they're dealing with the death. The rest of these people are just yapping and being keyboard warriors on social media. Shonda, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. Again,
there you go.
As a pastor and a parent, it is heartbreaking to listen to how this family is not only trying to get answers through this autopsy, but also planning a celebration of Nolan's life. We heard his mom, and I believe I heard his heart as a mom, her heart as a mom, that this is a tough time, but she still wants to have this experience of Black joy as resistance. There is something to be said of that, but at the same time, we need answers. We need for the Department of Justice.
All right. Good evening, family. I wanted you to hear that Roland Martin segment right there. Roland made the most important point near the end of that segment. A lead is not a fact, and a viral post is it's not a case file. Okay, Ben Crump says his team is receiving between 50 and 100 calls a day. That sounds substantial, but every caller's information has to be authenticated. Who actually witnessed something? Who possesses an original photograph or video? Does the timestamp match? Has the file been altered? Can that person's account be corroborated? Crump also said some people talking to his investigators are not talking to local law enforcement. Now, as a retired cop, that concerns me. Okay. It doesn't automatically mean those witnesses distrust the truth. It may mean that they distrust the process. Listen, either way, investigators cannot test evidence they never receive. The family's team and law enforcement need a method for sharing legitimate information without exposing or intimidating witnesses. Okay, the joint inspection of Nolan's cell phone is therefore important. Okay, both sides will see the extraction at the same time. But until that examination is completed, we cannot say as a fact that somebody deliberately deleted evidence. That is precisely what the forensic examination is supposed to determine. Okay, the same restraint applies to the grand jury. Okay, presentation to a grand jury doesn't mean somebody is about to be charged. It means the evidence can eventually be placed before citizens who will decide whether probable cause exists. Okay, so right now the investigation is not complete. All right. Roland also pushed back on people blaming Nolan's parents and manufacturing racial narratives from behind a keyboard. Okay, Nolan's mother asked people to remain peaceful while her family tries to bury their son. Okay, that request deserves to be requested. Supporting this family doesn't require threatening witnesses, relatives, or anybody else connected to the case. Now, here is what has changed since that segment was recorded. I believe it was recorded yesterday. New tracking data places the boat leaving Horn Island without Nolan at approximately 4:31 p.m. And newly released audio confirms that the boat's bilge pump had failed, and the people aboard were calling for assistance because the boat was taking on water. Now, when the caller was asked whether everyone aboard was okay, the answer was yes. The word on board, okay, that one single word, on board, matters here. Okay, that response tells us about the people physically on the boat. Now, it doesn't establish whether Nolan had been accounted for before they departed. The FBI is assisting with digital evidence and threats connected to the case, but Jackson County remains the lead investigative agency. We still do not have publicly released autopsy or toxicology findings. So, listen, that show you saw, Roland Martin segment, gives us the family's concerns, the investigative commitments, and the danger of false narratives. So the latest reporting gives us a more precise boat timeline. All right. Neither one yet tells us how Nolan Wells died. Okay. And that remains the question the evidence must answer. Keep Nolan's family in your thoughts, y'all. We are moving into the official show now, right? And yeah, I just want to make sure I give you a warning, give you a heads up. This headline segment does include images of shrouded bodies and grieving relatives in Gaza. Let's go ahead and play the clip. First, I want to say that we are beginning with the day's headlines here, okay? That includes the expanding war with Iran and another congressional fight over American assistance to Israel. The power of the Justice Department, dangerous heat, deaths connected to ICE operations, and a Palestinian doctor still being held by Israel. Then we're going to actually slow everything down for tonight's main story. Author and journalist Susan Saulny discovered that two brothers from the same Black Creole family crossed America's color line in different directions. One remained Black and in New Orleans. The other moved to Chicago and lived as white. Those consequences reached far beyond complexion. They affected employment, education, home ownership, family relationships, safety, and what later generations were allowed to know about themselves. Okay. Our rule tonight is simple. We will separate what has been established from what officials claim, what families or witnesses allege, what the available evidence suggests, and what remains unknown. I spent 20 years working as a police officer, and I'm also an Army veteran. Evidence matters to me because decisions have consequences, all right? Especially when government power or somebody's life is involved. Well, let's go ahead and play the clip. And we're going to begin with the headlines. Amy Goodman, take it away.
Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The U.S. has struck Iran for a fifth consecutive day, targeting the capital, Tehran, and port cities, including Bandar Abbas, which is home to the headquarters of Iran's Navy. On Thursday morning, the U.S. fired on an oil tanker attempting to reach Harg Island in the Strait of Hormuz. In retaliation, Iran attacked Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan. Iran's military warned if President Trump follows through on his threat to strike civilian infrastructure, it would strike all infrastructure across the Gulf. At least 35 civilians have been killed by U.S.
Amy Goodman, are you going to cooperate with me tonight here? Let's see if we can start it over again. See if that helps. Okay, stand by.
Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The U.S. has struck Iran for a fifth consecutive day, targeting the capital, Tehran, and port cities, including Bandar Abbas, which is home to the headquarters of Iran's Navy. On Thursday morning, the U.S. fired on an oil tanker attempting to reach Harg Island in the Strait of Hormuz. In retaliation, Iran attacked Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan. Iran's his wife Asma, and their 6-year-old daughter Habiba. Their 3-year-old son Sami was injured. This is a relative of the family.
This poor innocent civilian family that has no connection to any military action is a neutral family who was sleeping. Their children were sleeping in their mother's lap. This is how innocent civilians are bombed on these nights, which are said to include a truce and peace.
Since last October's so-called ceasefire, Israeli forces have...
Listen, we need to be precise about what little we just heard here. And let me go ahead and fill you in. The United States is now several days into direct strikes connected to the war with Iran, okay? We're also hearing reports of an attack involving an oil tanker near the Strait of Hormuz and expanding Israeli military operations, okay? That's not some distant regional inconvenience. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important energy corridors in the world, okay? Military escalation there can affect shipping, energy prices, insurance costs, and the broader global economy if you never watch a minute of foreign policy coverage. And listen, we also need to distinguish verified events from statements issued by governments participating in the conflict. Okay, casualty figures attributed to Iranian authorities are official claims. They should be reported as such until they can be independently confirmed. And listen, the same standard applies to claims coming from Washington, all right? Israel, Iran, or anybody else with a direct interest in shaping public opinion. A government saying something loudly, it doesn't just erase our obligation to examine the evidence, all right? And we're going to attempt to play this clip again.
Killed more than 1,100 Palestinians in Gaza. Israel's security cabinets approved nearly $500 million in funding for 34 new settlements in the occupied West Bank. That's according to far-right Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. Under his tenure, 103 Israeli settlements have already been established in the occupied West Bank, violating international law. This comes amidst growing Israeli settler violence against Palestinians and their property. This is Bezalel Smotrich.
We are making sure that the decision approving one government budget decision after another, budgets for roads, budgets for infrastructure, and also budgets for constructions, caravans.
On Capitol Hill, half of all Democrats voted Wednesday to support a measure slashing military funding to Israel. The amendment proposed by Republican Congressmember Thomas Massie would have eliminated $3.3 billion in annual U.S. military assistance to Israel. The measure was ultimately defeated by House Republicans. Proposed by Republican Congressman aid to any country that does not comply with U.S. law, interests, and values. The Netanyahu government has failed to meet that standard, she said. The former House Speaker, Congressmember Nancy Pelosi of California, also voted to cut off funding to Israel, saying Americans, quote, are rightly demanding an end to a perpetual cycle of war, and the Netanyahu government cannot maintain its aid to any country that does not comply.
Defense attorney.
Government cannot maintain.
Okay, let me pause right there. There are several separate developments packed into that section right there. Okay, first, there are additional reported deaths in Gaza and the continued expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. Second, the House considered an amendment concerning American security assistance to Israel. Okay, that amendment failed by a vote of 104 to 314. 103 Democrats joined Republican Thomas Macy in supporting it. But let's be careful about how that vote is described, all right? It wasn't a successful vote ending all American aid to Israel. Okay, the amendment failed and the larger system of American assistance remains in place. What the vote does show is that opposition inside Congress is no longer confined to a tiny handful of members. More lawmakers are now willing to put their names on the second, rather on the record, even when they know the amendment is probably going to lose. Okay, now that shift matters politically, but it shouldn't be confused with a policy victory that did not occur. Okay, let's play this clip.
Its current course, Pelosi said. The Senate Judiciary Committee heard testimony Wednesday from Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, whom Trump has nominated to fill the role permanently. Democrats grilled Blanche over the Justice Department's handling of the Epstein files, the Trump administration's so-called anti-weaponization fund, and President Trump's $100 million settlement, it's believed, with the IRS.
Criminal defense attorney. I'm not sure there's very many people who have ever had a criminal defense attorney who calls that person their friend.
Republican Senator John Cornyn of Texas signaled he was undecided on Blanche. A no vote from Cornyn would effectively sink Blanche's nomination for Attorney General. President Trump's pick to replace 2020 election. Jay Clayton was testifying before the Senate Intelligence Committee at his confirmation hearing. Here he is being questioned by Georgia Democrat Jon Ossoff.
You refuse to answer a simple matter of fact about the 2020 election. Is that right?
No, that's not right.
Then answer the question. Who won the 2020 election?
I have answered the question.
Answer it. What is your answer?
I've given you my answer.
What is your answer? You refuse. What is your answer? You refuse to answer a basic question about who won a presidential election, but you asked to lead America's intelligence community? Isn't it humiliating to be unable to answer this question, to have to indulge the president's delusions?
Jay Clayton also claimed not to know last year, and he defended President Trump's proposed last year, and he defended President Trump's proposed.
I just want to interject. These are one of the few individuals in this administration that is not a dummy. He's very well educated. I think he's got a degree from Penn State, among other, prestigious degrees. So he's not a dummy. He knows the answer to these questions. It's just Senator Jon Ossoff happens to be an equally smart, person. That was just the right person right there to put him on the spot and make him answer these questions. Go ahead and finish playing the tape.
His $1.8 billion so-called anti-weaponization fund to compensate Trump allies and insurrectionists. Jay Clayton's the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, where he oversaw the Justice Department indictment of former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro on drug trafficking charges. Meanwhile, the New York Times filed a motion to quash subpoenas that Jay Clayton and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan served to New York David McGraw said, quote, "We are going to court to defend our journalists' rights to report freely on the administration and to provide the public with stories that matter," he said. The subpoenas were delivered to 4 Times journalists at their homes Friday to testify before a federal grand jury in the Southern District of New York. The Pentagon's announced plan.
Okay, look, again, those are distinct stories right there in that segment. One concerns Todd Blanche and questions surrounding the Justice Department. Another concerns Jay Clayton. The third concerns subpoenas involving journalists and records connected to reporting by the New York Times. Okay, they belong in the same broader conversation because they involve institutional power, but they're not one single case. Okay, when federal prosecutors seek information connected to journalists, the question is bigger than whether you personally like the newspapers involved. Let's play the rest of this.
To screen the testosterone levels of service members over the age of 30 and will.
Okay, that's crazy. That's just, we'll get to that in a second here. But government officials do not get to decide that press freedom only applies to reporters who treat them favorably, all right? The public needs journalists who can investigate government activity without automatically exposing confidential reporting methods or sources to the same government being investigated, all right? Every subpoena still has to be evaluated according to its actual language and legal basis. But the principle is worth defending before the government comes after a source or a reporter you happen to trust. So let's play this testosterone segment here.
Offer voluntary replacement therapy to those with low T-scores. The initiative was announced Wednesday by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who's branded the Pentagon as the high T Department of War.
I'm authorizing a new screening program for testosterone deficiency for our service members, ensuring you have the right testosterone levels to operate at your absolute best.
The Pentagon did not say whether women evaluated for other hormone deficiencies. This comes after Hegseth last year ordered a halt to all gender-affirming medical procedures for service members and removed openly transgender troops from the denying others promotions. In Georgia, another prisoner.
Okay, look, here's the important distinction in that Pentagon policy right there. The screening is mandatory for service members over 30. Testosterone therapy is not mandatory. That doesn't eliminate every concern, but accuracy matters here in the reporting. The reasonable questions are what medical information will be collected, all right? Who will have access to it? And how it might affect deployment or promotion decisions, and whether treatment remains a genuine choice once someone's results become part of a military record. Listen, service members, they already surrender a degree of medical privacy because readiness is a legitimate military concern. But readiness cannot become a blank check for ideological experiments or unnecessary intrusion into somebody's medical decisions. Mandatory screening and mandatory treatment are not the same thing. We shouldn't be reporting them as though they are. And we have a comment in the Substack rooms right here. Lynette says, testosterone grift, assuring that I can funnel money to a third party tester and testosterone replacement to the farm companies. No flu shot, no COVID shot, but testosterone. Yeah, that shows you where their priorities are, Lynette. Lynette furthermore says, not to mention that testosterone fluctuates. You would have different numbers in a hour. This administration, the people within this administration already have a reputation for dismissing science. So I doubt whether scientific accuracy is a concern here. All right, just keeping it real, just being honest. Just go ahead and play the rest of this clip.
Died in the custody of ICE. That's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. On Wednesday, ICE announced 45-year-old Venezuelan immigrant Jesus Manuel Arenas Silva was found unresponsive in a bus that was transporting him from one ICE jail to another with a suspected cause of death listed as cardiac arrest. It's at least the 22nd such death this year. The Department of Homeland Security said Wednesday it would reverse plans to halt traffic stops following the shooting deaths of 2 immigrants by ICE agents in less than a week. The reversal came after President Trump wrote on social media, "We cannot give up one of ICE's most important and effective crime-fighting tools, the traffic stop!" Adding it arrest. It's at least the 20 things reached hazardous levels.
Let's go back.
Following the shooting deaths of 2 immigrants by ICE agents in less than a week. The reversal came after President Trump wrote on social media, "We cannot give up one of ICE's most important and effective crime-fighting tools, the traffic stop!" Adding, "It won't happen on my watch," Trump
There
wrote.
we go. Adding, "It won't happen on my watch." I wanted to make sure and get that in there. Listen, there are also separate ICE-related events in that report you're listening to, and they shouldn't be blended into one incident. One person reportedly died while being transported in ICE custody with an apparent medical emergency under investigation. Separately, 2 people died in shootings involving ICE personnel during traffic stop encounters. Okay, the government's initial response included a temporary pause affecting certain traffic stop operations. That pause was then reversed. When an agency changes a policy after fatal encounters, that tells us the agency itself recognized a problem serious enough to require immediate review. Okay, reversing that policy doesn't answer what was learned during the pause. It raises more questions. Like, for example, like, what instructions were officers operating under? What changed after the shootings? Did the agency identify deficiencies involving tactics, supervision, communication, or use of force? Why was the pause lifted? Listen, those questions are not anti-law enforcement. A legitimate law enforcement agency should be able to explain its policy, justify its tactics, and account for deadly outcomes. And I say that as someone who spent 2 decades working as a patrol officer. You cannot demand unquestioning public confidence while withholding the information the public needs to evaluate your actions. Okay, if this kind of evidence-based breakdown matters to you, I need you to subscribe here on YouTube and also join the paid community at XPLisset.com and subscribe. Okay, independent work like this takes time, and it is your support that keeps XVOA independent And I thank all of my paid subscribers that are already on the roster here. So let's talk about smoke and extreme heat. Play the clip.
About 100 million people in North America are under air quality alerts today as a thick blanket of smoke descends on cities from the upper Midwest to northeastern states. Overnight, air quality readings reached hazardous levels in cities including Minneapolis, Detroit, and Toronto. Forecasters warn New York and many East Coast cities will spend another day under hazy orange skies. More than 1,000 active fires are burning in Canada and dozens more in Minnesota.
Yeah, what was that?
1,000 active fires are burning in Canada and dozens more in Minnesota. Meanwhile, more than 100 million people from the plains to the East Coast face heat advisories or extreme heat warnings today, with a massive heat dome bringing triple-digit heat and record temperatures to many areas. And here in New York.
Okay. So, listen, extreme heat and smoke are not background inconveniences here. They increase the risk of respiratory illness, heat exhaustion, and death, particularly for children, older people, outdoor workers, and people without reliable housing or air conditioning. Listen, it's very simple. Check on people. Hydrate before you feel thirsty. And do not assume someone is safe simply because they are indoors. Next up, Dr. Hassoum Abu Safia. An Israeli detention.
New York City, dozens of pro-Palestine activists gathered for a vigil to demand the release of Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, the director of Gaza's Kamel Adwan Hospital, who has been held in Israeli detention without charge since his abduction by Israeli troops 18 months ago. International calls to free Dr. Abu Safia have been mounting over the past month as his family and lawyers say he's facing possible death due to torture and medical neglect. This is Pam Sporn, a member of New York City Jewish Elders and Jewish Voice for Peace. And lawyers say he's facing possible death due to torture and medical neglect. This is Pam Sporn, a member of New York City Jewish, and lawyers say he's facing possible death.
Break it off right there. Listen, Dr. Hussam, make sure I pronounce this right, don't mangle this name. Dr. Hussam Abu Safia remains in Israeli detention, okay? Supporters and human rights advocates continue to raise concern about his health. And there's allegations concerning his treatment. Those allegations require scrutiny, okay? And Israeli authorities remain responsible for accounting for the condition and treatment of every person in their custody. Medical professionals do not lose their human rights because they provided care in a war zone, all right? That's just basic human dignity, basic human rights. So those are today's headlines. Now, we're going to slow it down a little bit and look at one family that that lived on both sides of what can only be described as America's color line. But they both experienced very different consequences, and even though they grew up in the same environment. And before we talk about how skin color split one family, we're going to just catch up on some of the notes here in the room. If anyone on YouTube is listening, if you've got a comment you want to chime in, please do. I will read your note on air. Lynette says, how can ICE traffic stop? Well, they are law enforcement officers. They just happen to be federal law enforcement officers. And, this is something that, we've got to talk about just the sheer number of alphabet agencies involved, some of whom do regular traffic stops or traffic stops on a regular basis. You won't see all of this unless you live in someplace like Washington, D.C., the district, where you have different overlapping jurisdictions of federal agencies that perform traffic stops on a regular, probably do more traffic stops than a county agency, for example, who, are also out busy running alarm calls. They're also responding to high priority robberies, suspicious calls, and taking routine theft reports. Okay, so the United States Park Police is a perfect example. Okay, their jurisdiction is the parks, so they do a lot of patrolling around roads and highways that go through the federal parks. So right there, it's a federal agency, does a lot of traffic stops. Uniform Secret Service, they do regular patrols in the district, and occasionally they do perform a traffic stop. They try to avoid it. And my suspicion is traffic stops was something that ICE tried to avoid, tried to stay away from. It was not their primary mission until recently. And it's obvious. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like, my law enforcement experience gives me some, it's obvious, on its face, they have not had the training. Because listen, it's also experience. All right. I may have gotten the training in the academy on how to do a traffic stop. It's not like years, right? We're talking about a month to two. Well, I wouldn't say 2 months. About 4 weeks of high intensity, traffic training. But you have to reinforce that training with actual experience out on the streets. And even if a lot of federal officers get the same training, they don't get it reinforced on the street. They don't practice that training on the street. So, where was I? I was talking about the comments. Lynette says, here in Northeast PA, jurisdiction issues. I question if we are not over-policed. Just too many cooks in the kitchen. I know you just have a puzzle of agencies in Pennsylvania that, and ironically, a lot of people came out of Pennsylvania, out of that area of Pennsylvania, 100, 200 miles to work in our agency just because, the jobs were just not there. They were all filled up. All right. So, house skin color, split one family. Let's go ahead and play that clip.
To torture and medical neglect. This is Pam Sporn, a member of New York City Jewish Elders and Jewish Voice for Peace.
Oh yeah, and before I forget, you guys in the Substack chat, smash that heart button. I don't need to tell you why. All right? The algorithm and all that, push it out to people who who need to see and hear this.
Peace.
Okay, we got the black screen. That's our cue. Standby is coming up. There we go.
We turn now to a deeply personal story of race in America. 100 years ago, two black brothers from New Orleans were separated by the harsh reality of the Jim Crow laws. One lived as a black man in Louisiana. The other, with lighter skin, moved to Chicago, passing as white.
Listen, before we go further, right? Here, this is a family structure, okay, that we need to remember. You know, this isn't a story in which an entire family simply decided to become white. It is the story of two brothers from the same family.
Deeply personal story of race in America. 100 years ago, two black brothers from New Orleans were separated by the harsh reality of the Jim Crow laws. One lived as a black man in Louisiana. The other, with lighter skin, moved to Chicago, passing as white. Journalist Susan Saulny uncovered this story by tracing her own ancestry, and she joins Michelle Martin to discuss the legacy of this long-buried family secret. Deeply personal story of race in America. 100 years ago, two black brothers from...
Okay. Listen, George remained George remained in New Orleans, and he lived as a black man. His lighter-skinned brother, Edward, moved to Chicago and lived as white. So just the difference of a few shades of skin affected how America classified them and what America allowed each brother's family to become. I want you to pay attention to the choices, but also pay attention to the system that made those choices valuable.
From New Orleans were separated by the harsh reality of the Jim Crow laws. One lived as a black man in Louisiana. The other, with lighter skin, moved to Chicago, passing as white. Journalist Susan Saulny uncovered this story by tracing her own ancestry, and she joins Michelle Martin to discuss the legacy of this long-buried family secret.
Thanks, Christiane. Susan Saulny, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you for having me.
And I
passing as white. Journalist family secret.
Thanks, Christiane. Susan Saulny, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you for having me.
And I understand that you are joining us from a very meaningful and very beautiful location. Where are you?
I'm in the Lower Garden District of New Orleans. I'm on Prytania Street, inside the home, believe it or not, of my great-great-grandfather, Colonel Joseph H. DeGrange.
Amazing, amazing. And one of the reasons this is amazing is that your
great-grandfather, Colonel Joseph H. DeGrange.
Amazing, amazing. And one of the reasons this is amazing is that your article begins with a family mystery and it ends with a family reunion. So, but before
and the
we get
reunion
to that,
was right here,
was
in
right
this
there
house.
In that house. So let me start with what was the mystery?
Well, my grandfather and his brother spent time in an orphanage in New Orleans in the 1910s, and it was a pretty grim existence. They aged out of the orphanage at a time of harsh segregation in the South. And one of the brothers, Edward, who was just a few shades lighter than my grandfather, George, decided to take a chance on a better life in Chicago as a white man. And his skin color allowed him to do that. My grandfather, being just a shade or two darker, didn't make that choice. I don't know if he wanted to or chose not to. reality is he stayed in New Orleans and lived as a Black man. So what we have from that point are parallel lives of one brother living in New Orleans and having children and grandchildren, and one brother living as white in Chicago and having children and grandchildren. We have a very neat 100-year arc to look at. So that Edward left the family and passed for white in another city, that was the secret. That was the secret that I've known since I was a little girl, and we were taught not. And passed for white in another city, that was the secret. That was the secret that I've known since I was.
Okay, let's stop right there on the word secret, because it's easy from the safety of 2026 to hear the word secret and assume the family was simply ashamed of being Black. But listen, exposure could carry severe consequences. A person discovered passing as white could lose employment, housing, social standing, and physical safety. The accusation that someone had committed racial fraud could destroy an entire household. This was happening in a country where racial classification was enforced through law, employment, housing, schools, marriage, marriage restrictions, intimidation, mob violence. Secrecy could therefore function as protection. Now, listen, that doesn't mean that there was no shame or internal conflict, right? It means we should not reduce every decision to shame when survival was also on the table here. And the secret protected Edward's new life, right? Also separated his descendants from part of their family, their history, and themselves. Okay, play the clip.
As a little girl, and we were taught not to talk about.
That's so. I have so many questions. How did this come up when you were a child?
Well, my grandfather still loved his brother, and I think he wished him the best in life. And if Edward thought that this was his opportunity to go chase the American dream.
Okay, let's stop right there. I have an important, important and big comment, and I don't want to forget it and let it slide here. See, Lynette says the brothers were orphaned following their mother's death. I got Network Nova Live. Thank you for joining us. She says, a must read, one of my favorite books, the story of J.P. Morgan's personal librarian and why she chose to pass as white. Read more. She's got the link down here in the Substack chat. She furthermore said, whoa, are we still there? Okay. She says the remarkable little-known story of Bella DaCosta Green, J.P. Morgan's personal librarian, who became one of the most powerful women in New York despite the dangerous secret she kept in order to make her dreams come true. From the New York Times bestseller. Really great story. Okay, thank you for that. Let's go ahead and play the clip.
George wanted him to do it. George was a protective older brother, and he wanted us to protect Edward by not talking about it because there was tremendous amount of risk involved. And we're talking about a time when a Black man found to be posing as white could face enormous violence, mob violence, perhaps even lynching. He could be accused of race fraud, lose his job, lose his home. So be accused of race fraud, lose his job, lose his home. So in my grandfather's time, this secret was truly life and death. And he passed that sense on to his children who knew that their uncle passed, but that they weren't to talk about it. And then my parents' generation passed it on to me and my cousins, of which there are 30. So, yes, George created a really big family.
He may not have been rich in possessions, but he was rich in love.
Right. We see that both brothers were able to create things from scratch. And home ownership and buying a car, and the children went to college, some went on to law school. Everyone had a nice amount of success and achievement, comfortable lifestyle, summers on Lake Michigan. In George's case, now remember, same upbringing of these boys, just a few shades apart in color. George didn't have those opportunities in New Orleans. George couldn't find work except as a bricklayer, and he laid bricks.
Okay, go ahead. He laid bricks?
Except as a bricklayer, and he laid bricks until he retired. He was living in poverty for quite a lot of time during the Depression, and I've heard stories about how he burned his own furniture for firewood when it was cold, or how he would go look for food that had fallen off of cargo ships unloading at the docks. And this was a man who had a good amount of intelligence and ambition, but you can see how race plays out across time, across families. And that's what I was hoping this article would show, that docks. And this was a man who had a good amount of intelligence and ambition.
Okay, let's pause right there. This is where the material consequences become impossible to ignore here, all right? Edward's branch experienced a smoother path into the middle class. That included education, home ownership, professional opportunity, and family summers along Lake Michigan. George, however, remained in New Orleans, worked as a bricklayer, and endured deep poverty during the Depression. As you heard, extraordinary, right? His family burned furniture for warmth and searched around cargo docks for food that had fallen during the loading and unloading. These were brothers, remember, that were in the same family. They had the same family origin. One had access to opportunities associated with whiteness, all right? The other was confined by the economic restrictions placed on Black people. So we shouldn't soften this by pretending that passing offered Edward no meaningful advantage here. Okay, clearly it did. It opened doors and created economic security that George's family was denied. Okay, and the cost wasn't the absence of opportunity. The cost was what? Separation from family, culture, history, and the constant danger that discovery could destroy what Edward had built. The injustice is that America attached such different futures to racial categories, to skin color, that were themselves unstable, arbitrary, and often based on appearance. Okay, let's play the tape.
But you can see how race plays out across time, across families. And that's what I was hoping this article would show, that we know passing happened as a historical fact, but what was the emotional toll, the psychological toll, and how did the pain morph and mutate over generations? That's what I was hoping my story would show, to add to the conversation, to see the real lived experiences of an actual family going through this. Black and
First American Pope, his family had Creole roots in New Orleans. And how did that make you kind of think differently about your family, or did it?
It did. I remember when the American Pope was announced and the amount of excitement I saw in the media all across the country. And then later that night, for it to be confirmed by a local historian here in New Orleans and also the Archdiocese of New Orleans, that in fact, Pope Leo's maternal grandparents lived in the 7th Ward of New Orleans. This is a historic center of Afro-Creole culture, and that they identified as Black and mulatto while here, but then lived as a white family in Chicago. It sort of felt like the quiet part of so many Creole family histories was just said out loud. The circumstances of the time that might lead someone to make a decision that way. I could focus on my own family and just provide some historical context that might be helpful in this moment. That was one reason. And my mother has never known, she's 85 now, what happened to her Uncle Edward. She didn't know if he died young or lived to an old age, how many children he had, if he had children at all. And I wanted to give her some peace of mind as she enters all. And I wanted to give her some peace of mind as she enters her final years. And I had a feeling that since the secret now is not a matter of life and death, that this third generation of descendants of Edward would probably be more open to having more information about their family. And it turns out that all of that was true.
Well, hold on that thought for a second. Just grandfather lived in that house. What's the story there?
That's a really great question, and that's the crux of it all. So this house was built in the mid-1800s, and the owner, my great-great-grandfather, used enslaved labor to build wealth and was someone who fought for the South in the Civil War. His son thought differently, and his son, my great-grandfather Ned, ended up having a very open relationship with a Black woman in the city who lived just a few miles away in Treme, which is, the historic heart of Creole culture. I would say a lot of white men at the time had second families or secret families, but what was different about this relationship is that Ned and Minerva lived openly. Ned was different for his time, and I've tried to figure out why. And I think that maybe some of his formative years were during Reconstruction, and maybe he had a more optimistic spirit about what the future was going to be like for African Americans. Maybe he thought it would be easier over the long run than indeed it turned out to be. But long story.
Okay, let's stop right there. Long story short, look at what exists inside this one family's history here. Okay, that house on, what was it? Britannia Street, I think, was built during the 19th century with enslaved labor. Okay, the family patriarch, Colonel Joseph DeGrange, he was a Confederate veteran. Okay, not just a veteran. Okay, he was on the other side. Right, he's a Confederate veteran, and he supported, of course, racial separation. His son Ned openly lived with a Black woman named Minerva in Treme, and they had children. But after Minerva died, Colonel DeGrange didn't bring those children into his household as accepted members of the family. George and Edward eventually spent time in the the Lafon Asylum for colored boys. I want you to think about that. Blood relation did not protect those children. Right? Their connection to property didn't protect them. Their connection to a socially prominent white family didn't protect them. Okay, once society went ahead and classified them as Black, the racial boundary outweighed the family boundary. And the same family line contained wealth created through enslaved labor, a Confederate defender of white supremacy, mixed race descendants, and children placed in an orphanage because the white side of their family wouldn't fully claim them. That is not an inconsistency outside of American history here. That is American history. Okay, let's play this thing.
Short, Ned and his father had a falling out over this because you can imagine a Confederate veteran son who is openly living and having children with a Black woman. The colonel who lived here in this house did not approve. And so when the children's mother died young and Ned found himself alone with those children, my great-great-grandfather who lived here in 8,000 square feet of space did not take them in. And that's how they ended up in children. My great-great-grandfather who lived here in 8,000 square feet of space did not take them in. And that's how they ended up in an orphanage called the LaFawn Asylum for colored boys.
So how did Edward wind up getting to Chicago? How did that happen?
I think Edward, through his father, had some exposure to the white world and probably picked up on how to pretend to be a part of it. And with his light complexion, I think one day in his late teens or early 20s, he decided that there's nothing for me in New Orleans. No parents, no money, no job opportunities, not much education. I haven't interviewed him since he died in the 1970s, but I'm imagining that he had to make a very hard choice between family and survival, and he chose survival. And I don't know as well whether my grandfather was upset about this or distraught or supported it, but however he felt, in the end, he decided to keep the secret and wish for the best for his brother.
So let's fast forward. You always knew that you had this ancestor who, passé blanc, right? You weren't really sure how for want of a better term, I'll call it the white branch of the family, would react to your queries. What were you anxious about or worried about?
I think there are a lot of things. I think
really sure how for want of a better term, I'll call it the white branch of the family, would react to your queries. What were you anxious about or worried about?
I think there are a lot of things. I think my grandfather's voice was still in the back of it was in my ear somewhere saying, we just leave well enough alone. For what reason? Just leave things alone. And so I was going against my grandfather's wishes. So just personally, as a granddaughter who's somewhat obedient, right? And then there's the fact that 20 years or so ago, I lived in Chicago and I could have reached out to them. But yeah, think of the amount of racial animus in our country right now and the polarization and the fact that hate crimes based on race are rising and not going down. I remember thinking, maybe this is something I just don't want to touch. I prioritized it now for I would react, my mother's age, and the Pope's announcement. And also, I thought, we're in a society now that is so deeply connected online and in every other way, it's hard to keep a secret these days. I had a feeling that I'd be giving them information that maybe they already knew, or at least had an inkling of, and sure enough, that turned out to be the case.
So how did you go about finding them? And, of course, here's the big reveal. How did they react when you reached out?
And that is a good question. Let's pause it right there. Because we need to preserve an important distinction here, right? Susan Saulny, rather, can document that Edward moved to Chicago and lived as a white man, right? She can document the life he built and the family separation that followed. Okay, but Edward died in the 1970s. She cannot ask him to explain every thought that centered his mind. When she describes him choosing between family and survival, this, she's offering an interpretation based on the historical conditions and the evidence she uncovered. Okay, it's a credible interpretation, but it is still an inference. Okay, we shouldn't transform it into a quotation or a confession Edward never gave. Susan also explains that she worried about contacting the white branch of the family, so to speak. She didn't know whether they would reject her, deny the connection, or respond with racial hostility. Listen, that there tells you the old color line wasn't safely buried in the past. It was still shaping what living relatives believed they might lose by finding each other. Go ahead and play the clip.
Right. Well, I had a good amount of research help, and I thank the New York Times for that. So we used all sorts of ancestry tools, and beyond that, I looked for obituaries. I looked on social media. We looked in old newspapers. There was a lot written in ancient French in New Orleans. We just tried to gather every bit of information we could about my grandparents and great-grandparents and their descendants. And then it just came down to the very gentle reaching out, hoping for the best. And I reached out with short messages, either over social media, or, if I found an email address, or maybe in a search, we'd come up with a phone number. But I broke through, say, first with one cousin. Her name is Christine. And I got such a positive reaction from her. I was really encouraged to keep going. As soon as she saw the message, she wrote back like something to the effect of, "Oh, hey, yes, of course, I would love to. When can we talk?" And then through Christine, I found out that she had longstanding questions that she wanted answered. And she said, "Cousin friend feels this way too." And so through one person, I learned of other people, and I just slowly made my way through the family tree, introducing myself as someone who shared a common ancestor, and also pointing out pretty quickly that I was a writer and reporter, and that I'd want to share our story.
When you first encountered some of the family members, when you all first met each other, there were tears.
Oh, yes.
There were tears.
Yes.
Would you say more about that?
When Edward left Louisiana and New Orleans, he left his culture, he left his kinship ties. He carried a secret along with his wife. She was also a very light complexioned Creole from Louisiana who was passing in Chicago as a white woman. So the two of them were bonded by their cover stories. And I think they must have lived with quite a bit of isolation because of fear. If you get too close to someone, maybe they'll figure something out. So one thing Christine described to me was always wanting extended family and wanting to know more about where they came from and who their grandparents were and things like that. And they didn't have that sense that I grew up with in New Orleans of an enormous, sprawling family and very clear lineage. And I think they wanted that. And when you long for that all your life, and then one day it's finally explained to you why you didn't have it, that all your life, and then one day it's finally explained to you why you didn't have it, and then you have it because we were all there with open arms. I think the emotion of it was just overwhelming to them.
Does anyone not feel that way?
It's a totally understandable and legitimate question. I think anger is among the responses that a person could have, especially in the past.
Okay, pause right there on anger. Okay, listen, family secrets that once depended on distance are much harder to maintain now. DNA databases, you got digitized newspapers, census records, obituaries, social media, and searchable archives. They can reconnect branches that spent generations apart. Susan used those tools to reach Christine and the white branch of Edward's family, and that branch was not simply sitting there with a complete history, deliberately refusing to acknowledge it. Okay. They had questions too. They had gaps and suspicions that they couldn't fully explain. So the reason that matters is because descendants inherit the consequences of decisions they didn't make. One branch inherited exclusion and the knowledge that a relative had left. The other inherited greater access to whiteness, but lost the truth about part of its ancestry. And when the branches family reunited, the tears were not only about a historical discovery, they were about finally meeting family members who they shouldn't never have been made strangers. And the thing I like about Susan, she's honest about the anger. You know, as a child, she wondered whether Edward had left because his black family wasn't good enough for him. Let's play the rest of this.
Past, right? You know, why him and not us? And was it a selfish and escapist thing to do? I think when I was a little girl and I first heard the story of the man in the picture who left the family, say I'm like 8, 9, or 10, I thought, what, we weren't good enough for him? Why did he leave? You know, and I may have had these feelings that were anger, but I didn't understand everything then. As I grew up, I understood more, and I can see him as a fuller person and with a lot of empathy. And now, of course, I totally understand. Of empathy. And now, of course, I totally understand that he was stuck in a terrible system that forced hard choices on people who I'm sure would have rather do other things with their lives. But the system of judging people along color lines and then meting out opportunity along those lines is illogical, absurd, and completely arbitrary. And that's what I want to show with this family story, and what I'd hope, that the story gives us an opportunity about our own racial history in this country and how it plays out in families across time.
So before we let you go, the country is beginning to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. Your story encompasses almost all of it. Slavery, the Civil War, Jim Crow. It's just the Great Migration. And I just wonder if there's something that you're thinking about as the country enters this period of commemoration, as you thought about how your own family story fits into that bigger story. What comes to mind? And what would you like us to be thinking about?
That we're always part of the American past, but it is equally about love and loyalty and resilience and the possibility of new beginnings, of joy, of hope. And that latter part is the part I'm trying to focus on. And I think the more empathy we have for people who are not exactly like us, and in our case, it's me being Southern and Black and opening myself up to cousins in Chicago who are Midwestern and white, them doing the same, vice versa, the more we can see other people as extensions of ourselves, the more we will move our country forward out of the polarization.
All right, guys, sorry about that. Hey, when nature calls, you got to do what you got to do. Tried to hold out. We were right at the end. So we're going to note to the editor, stop right here. We're going to take it back. Let me play it back to where we left off. Try to give me some continuity in the post-production editing of this. We're just going to take it back a little bit more. Okay, let's go ahead and play
right?
from there.
My story, our
And then
story,
I'll
so many people's story is about race and
wrap it up.
poverty and injustice and a shameful part of the American past. But it is equally about love and loyalty and resilience and the possibility of new beginnings, of joy, of hope. And that latter part is the part I'm trying to focus on. And I think the more empathy we
Right. The more empathy.
And that latter part is the part I'm trying to focus on. And I think the more empathy we have for people who are not exactly like us, and in our case, it's me being Southern and Black and opening myself up to cousins in Chicago who are Midwestern and white, them doing the same, vice versa, the more we can see other people as extensions of ourselves, the more we will move our country forward out of the polarization and gridlock that we're seeing right now, and especially out of the
Out of the what? Out of the what? Say it.
As extensions of ourselves, the more we will move our country forward out of the polarization and gridlock that we're seeing right now, and especially out of the pits of racial animus that have gripped some of us in the wake of the last several years of many prominent people in this nation trying to pit us against one another and framing things in terms of us versus them. I think this is an opportunity to look at our past and get a deeper understanding of what still needs to be healed in America.
Susan Saulny, thank you so much.
Versus them. I think this is an opportunity to look at our past and get a deeper understanding of what still needs to be healed
We're almost
in America.
there. We're seconds away from
Susan
the end.
Saulny, thank you so much. much for talking with us.
My pleasure, Michelle. Thank you.
All right. That was Anna, what's that? Amampur and Company. So I like the way at the end she kind of made that connection to the current events of the day. This wasn't just that was in the past type of thing. What can I add to that? A racial system made separation profitable and family recognition dangerous. It rewarded Edward for concealing who he was. It punished George for remaining where America could identify him as black. Okay, the brothers made different choices, but the color line established the price of each choice here. And my final comments on this. Look, a few shades of skin color changed everything for this family because America had already decided that skin color would determine everything. It influenced where the brothers could live, what jobs they could hold, whether they could own property, how their children would be educated, and whether relatives could safely acknowledge one another. Edward crossed the color line and gained access to the material advantages associated with whiteness. George remained classified as black and carried the economic burden America attached to that classification. But neither branch escaped without a cost, okay? George's branch experienced poverty and exclusion. Edward's branch gained opportunity while losing part of its family history and living with a secret that could not be safely exposed. That is why the story cannot be reduced to whether Edward was right or wrong. The larger question is why the country created conditions under which denying your own family could appear to be a rational path towards survival. And listen, this history, it ain't just confined to to one New Orleans family. Okay, racial categories have never been as biologically fixed as the people enforcing them pretended. They were constructed, interpreted, and policed because they distributed power. The category decided who could enter the school, obtain the mortgage, inherit the property, receive protection from the law, or be recognized as fully belonging. That is the real inheritance Susan Saulny uncovered. Not simply a black branch and a white branch. It's a demonstration of how racial power can enter a family, divide it, reward one side, punish the other, and leave descendants carrying questions generations later. Look, I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you believe Edward's decision should primarily be understood as personal abandonment, survival under an oppressive system, or some combination of both? And if your family has discovered a hidden branch or a racial identity that previous generations concealed, share only what you feel comfortable sharing. Okay. Of course, you don't have to share it right here in the public space, these public comments, right? You may feel more comfortable commenting on the article. I can't promise I'll put this article right up shortly. I may decide not to publish it, given the amount of production challenges, that we had here with the skipping video. But listen, like this video. You can do that right now. Hit that heart button. Anybody on YouTube, please like this video. If you value this kind of independent work, become a paid subscriber at XPLisset.com. Subscribe. Paid subscribers provide that dependable base that allows XVOA to keep researching, documenting, and challenging convenient narratives. All right. And I want to thank you, send out a thank you to everyone already supporting this work. Okay. If a subscription is not right for you, you can still contribute at buymeacoffee.com. Tip 1, 2, 5, 300, 1,000. Okay. I'm kind of being facetious. All right. But seriously, $50 away. I always say $50 away keeps the pain away. And that's not just one person contributing $50. That's 10 people contributing $5. All right. So listen, I'm XPLisset. Thank you for spending this time with me. You guys take care of yourselves. And hold up. Let me read this one comment here. We've got a couple of comments here. Simone Y. Delaney, thank you for joining us. She says, harsh but true. I think she's talking about the allegiance that the fact that white people felt no allegiance whatsoever to their, the white grandparents, right? They felt no allegiance to their children. Lynette says, George Edward Ned DeGrange was the father of the two boys, Edward and George, right? Yeah, that was the Confederate colonel, right? Let's see. Lynette says, it seems to me we have a need to categorize and to determine who is in the in-group. And Network Nova Live. Is that Finell or is it Catherine? I don't know which one. Someone's hiding. Oh, if you're hiding, I'm sorry to call you out. You're probably trying to be incognito. I just called you out. But anyway, listen. Network Nova, she said, it seems also an opportunity, a choice that is so bizarre because racism, but he took this as a way to use the system, but it has a cost. Yeah, I figured that was you, Catherine. Thank you for joining us. Lynette says, no, the colonel was the grandfather. Yeah, not the father. Did I say the father? Yeah, he was the grandfather. All right. Again, note to the editor, back it up to here. Let's cut all that other stuff out. I'm explicit. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves. Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention, we've got, I still haven't made up my mind if I'm going to cover this Trump thing live. Just be on the lookout. I may or may not hop on and try to make some sense of what is coming out of this man's mouth. I'm trying to be respectful. All right. So take care of yourselves. I'll see you on the next one. Over and out.